My family said I was too busy for tradition, but that didn't stop them from deleting me from the Thanksgiving group chat. I didn't reply. I didn't fight. While they toasted family unity, I hosted a global charity dinner at my luxury resort on the French Riviera, and every headline in America called it the most powerful Thanksgiving of the year. Then came 54 missed calls and one voicemail I'll never delete. I'm Clara Whitmore, and this is how I turned exclusion into elegance, and revenge into legacy. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Wednesday morning sunlight poured through the glass walls of my office, soft and golden, spilling across the Pacific. From the 14th floor of the Solara Foundation headquarters in San Diego, the ocean looked calm. Too calm for a day that felt like a storm waiting to happen. I was reviewing slides for the Thanksgiving Global Charity Dinner, a project I had planned for nearly a year. Each image glowed on the screen: children in solar-powered schools, women engineers working in rural towns, and finally the venue. A white resort perched above the Mediterranean cliffs. Sophie knocked twice before stepping in her tablet, tucked under her arm. Budget's finalized, she said, placing a folder on the desk. We just got confirmations from 6 countries, Julian Grant's team from New York, and even a representative from UNESCO. I nodded. Good. Make sure they all get the updated schedule for the gala dinner. Timing is everything. She smiled. This is going to be big, Clara. Maybe even bigger than the last summit in Geneva. I tried to smile back. Let's hope it's not about size this time. Just impact. The air smelled faintly of coffee and salt from the sea breeze drifting through the cracked window. Everyone around me was excited. Emails flying, meetings running, people talking about flights and menus and guest lists. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about family, but mine was always more about appearances. The phone on my desk buzzed. Dad calling. I froze. The words glowed on the screen, simple, cold. I hadn't spoken to him in months, maybe longer. Sophie caught my glance, hesitated, and quietly left the room. I let the phone ring twice before picking up. Hi, Dad. Clara. His voice was flat, clipped, the same tone he used when addressing board members. We're keeping Thanksgiving small this year. Just your sister and her family. No big gathering. My grip on the pen tightened until it clicked. I see, I said evenly. He didn't explain, didn't apologize. The silence between us was wide enough to fit every year we'd missed. Finally, I said, That's fine. I have something important tonight anyway. He paused. Maybe, surprised I didn't argue, maybe not. Good, he replied, and the line went dead. The dial tone hummed in my ear for a second longer than it needed to. Then I set the phone down. Outside the window, the sunlight shimmered on the Pacific like sheets of glass. For a moment, I watched the horizon blur into gold. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. A woman he no longer recognized. When I was a kid, Thanksgiving meant perfection, matching silverware linen napkins, folded into swans, my father at the head of the table with a glass of Cabernet. He liked symmetry, order, control. Every year he would give a speech about gratitude, while measuring every person's contribution to the family. Mine never quite made the cut. I exhaled slowly, the familiar ache rising in my chest, but fading just as fast. I'd learned long ago how to numb it. My phone vibrated again. A text from Daniel Reed, my legal advisor and oldest friend from Colombia. Press asking questions about Whitmore Holdings, rumor financial irregularities. Want me to comment? I stared at the message, then typed back, no comment. Not my storm. But I couldn't help it. I smiled. A small, almost invisible curve of satisfaction. For once, the scandal orbiting our last name didn't involve me. I crossed the room, stopped by the window, and leaned against the glass. The city stretched below the coastline, glittering like a blade. When they don't want to give you a seat, I whispered to myself, you build your own table. For a moment, I imagined the dinner at Azure Coast, white lanterns glowing under the Mediterranean sky, guests from around the world sitting at a table I had built not from legacy but from conviction. The office door opened again. Sophie peeked in, tentative. Everything okay? Perfect, I said, turning back to my laptop. Let's finalize the guest list and confirm the press coverage. I want this night to mean something. She nodded, relief crossing her face. You got it. As the door clicked shut, I looked down at the glowing slides again. The faces of women engineers, the children with solar lamps, the blue waves beyond the resort terrace. My heart steadied. Thanksgiving, I thought. A holiday about gratitude. For some, that meant carving turkey and making toasts. For me, it meant carving out space in a world that once told me there wasn't any for me at all. The phone on my desk stayed silent. The sea outside shimmered endlessly. I straightened my notes, took a breath, and said quietly to the empty room, "Let's make this dinner unforgettable." Thanksgiving 2005. The Whitmore estate in Santa Barbara glowed like a cathedral, crystal chandeliers, white linens, and a long mahogany table polished to perfection. Every detail of the night had my father's fingerprints on it. Even the way the chairs were arranged said something about order control and the hierarchy of the family. I sat at the far end next to the kids' table, even though I was 17. Veronica, 4 years older and effortlessly composed, stood near the head of the table, giving a toast. She wore the same smile she used for magazine covers, and courtroom debates, already rehearsing for the career my father had mapped for her before she was born. "To gratitude, and to family," she said, lifting her glass. "And to my father for reminding us every day that hard work pays off." Everyone laughed. Charles Whitmore, in his tailored suit and gold cufflinks, raised his glass with pride. "My daughter," he declared, "is the reason we'll have something to toast next year." Applause, laughter, the kind of polite noise that fills expensive rooms. I kept my eyes on the dessert tray, cutting the pumpkin pie into slices, so even they could pass as geometry homework. I waited for a pause in the conversation before saying quietly, "I won first place at the state science fair today." The chatter didn't stop. My father glanced my way but didn't meet my eyes. "That's nice," he said, still smiling toward Veronica, "but you know those things don't pay the bills." A few people chuckled. My throat burned, but I forced a small nod. I'd learned by then that silence was safer than sincerity. The plates clinked. The conversation drifted toward politics, then real estate, then Veronica's new internship. I faded into the hum of voices and the clatter of silverware. Inside, I whispered what I couldn't say aloud. There were only 2 ways to survive in this house: be silent or be flawless. And I was never good at either. After dinner, I slipped away while the others moved into the living room for coffee and brandy. My father's laugh carried down the hallway like a sermon. Upstairs, my room felt like another world. Quiet blue, smelling faintly of salt from the ocean breeze through the open window. The sound of the waves was soft, but constant. Somewhere far below the cliffs, the Pacific met the rocks breaking over and over. I sat at my desk, the one I'd covered in newspaper clippings about women scientists and space launches. My science fair trophy stood beside a half-finished model of a water purifier I'd built from recycled parts. I ran my fingers over the small brass plaque, Innovation Award, Santa Barbara District. I'd imagined showing it to my dad that morning, imagined him proud. But he hadn't even asked where I'd been. The door opened quietly. My mother, Evelyn, stepped in. She still wore her pearl earrings and a faint smile that never reached her eyes. "I thought you'd gone to bed," she said softly. "I will." I replied, still staring at the model. She crossed the room and placed her hand on my shoulder. "You did good today. I saw the article in the paper." I turned to her. "He didn't even care." Her hand squeezed gently. "He cares just differently." "That's not caring, Mom." My voice broke before I could stop it. "What do I have to do for him to see me?" She exhaled the way she always did before saying something she didn't want to say. "Your father only sees what he understands, and sometimes it takes a lifetime for him to understand love." I wanted to ask her why she stayed, why she kept playing the role of the perfect wife in the perfect house that wasn't really perfect at all. But she looked so tired, like asking would break her. "Don't let the way he sees you decide who you are," she whispered instead. "You're different, Clara. That's not a curse. Just don't let it turn into bitterness." She kissed the top of my head and left the room. The faint scent of her perfume lingered lilac and sadness. The house grew quiet again. The laughter downstairs had faded to murmurs, then to the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I opened the drawer, pulled out my small leather notebook, and sat under the lamp. The light was warm, golden, flickering slightly as if it were alive. I wrote slowly, each word deliberate. "One day I will leave this place. I won't need permission to exist. I stared at the sentence until the ink bled slightly through the page. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the low roar of the ocean closer. I closed the notebook, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark Pacific stretching to infinity. The lights of Santa Barbara twinkled behind me, but the sea was what held my gaze. Wide, unpredictable, and free, somewhere beyond that horizon, there was a life that didn't require approval. A life that didn't shrink to fit the expectations of a family name. I whispered into the dark. Someday. The waves answered with a rhythm steady as a heartbeat, and the clock downstairs kept time like a countdown. Spring of 2011. The house in Santa Barbara smelled like lemon polish and expensive silence. My acceptance letter from Columbia University lay on the coffee table between us, a thin piece of paper separating two entirely different worlds. Charles Whitmore sat across from me, fingers steepled, jaw set like carved stone. The morning sun filtered through the windows, landing on the gold crest at the top of the letter. Columbia's emblem, bright and hopeful. "You don't need to go to New York to dig through garbage," he said flatly, tossing the letter back onto the table. The edges curled where his fingers had gripped too tight. "There's work for you here. Your place is here. My place." I repeated quietly, almost to myself. I took a breath. My place is wherever I can stand on my own. He leaned back amused, as if I'd said something charmingly naive. The world isn't kind to dreamers, Clara, especially women who think they can build things better than men. Something in me cracked, but it wasn't anger. It was understanding, sharp and cold. I stood up slowly. Maybe kindness isn't what I'm looking for. His eyebrows lifted, that familiar smirk forming. "You sound like your mother when she forgets what gratitude means." I picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it back into the envelope. "I'll take that as a compliment." He laughed once, a hollow sound. "You'll be back in 6 months, broke, tired, and smarter." Maybe, I said, meeting his eyes for the first time, but at least I'll have tried. He turned away, dismissing me with a wave. The conversation was over. In his world, it always ended when he decided it did. That night, I didn't sleep. I packed quietly, folding jeans and notebooks into a small navy suitcase. The clock on my nightstand ticked too loud. Every sound in the house felt magnified. The wind against the glass, the creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the hundreds of dinners like tonight's argument, where my silence kept the peace and my ambition kept me awake. At dawn, I dragged the suitcase down the stairs, one careful step at a time. My mother was already standing by the front door in her robe, her hair pinned back, eyes tired but steady. She looked as if she'd been waiting there all night. She handed me a small white envelope. It was sealed blank on both sides. "Open it when you forget why you left," she said. I took it, trying to smile. "Thank you." We hugged without words. Her arms felt fragile but firm, like the only shelter I had ever known. I wanted to say something, anything, that would make her understand I wasn't angry with her for staying, but nothing came. When I stepped outside, the morning air was cool and heavy with dew. The taxi idled at the curb engine, humming softly. I turned once before getting in. Through the tall window of my father's office, I saw him silhouetted against the light, already on the phone, already in control of something that wasn't me. The driver loaded my suitcase and glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Airport." "Yes," I said. He nodded, and we pulled away. The house shrank behind us, then disappeared behind the rows of palm trees lining the street. At the Santa Barbara airport, I moved through security like a ghost, calm, detached, but vibrating inside. The boarding pass felt weightless in my hand, but my chest was heavy. I bought a coffee I couldn't afford, and sat by the window, staring at the runway. When they called my flight, I waited until the last possible minute to board. Something inside me wanted to memorize this feeling. The fear, the ache, the strange thrill of walking toward a future that didn't exist yet. On the plane, I found my seat by the window. The man next to me was already asleep, a newspaper folded across his lap. I leaned against the glass as the engines roared to life. The city outside blurred into gold and blue. I opened my leather notebook, the same one I had written in 6 years earlier, after that Thanksgiving dinner. The pages were creased and smudged. My old handwriting still sharp. One day, I will leave this place. I turned to a blank page and wrote slowly, the pen scratching steady against the paper. One day I will build a place where others have to ask permission to enter. The plane tilted upward, engines trembling, and the coastline vanished beneath a blanket of clouds. The light from the rising sun filled the cabin, reflecting off the wing like fire. I watched until the horizon melted into white, until Santa Barbara became just a memory of noise and control and the faint smell of lemon polish. I didn't know what waited for me in New York. I only knew what I was leaving behind. A family that measured worth by obedience, a father who mistook control for love, and a version of myself that was too afraid to take up space. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the vibration of the engines drown everything else out. I left Santa Barbara with $300, one suitcase, and the belief that if I failed, there'd be no place left for me to return. But for the first time in my life, that didn't scare me. Through the window, the sunlight caught the edge of the wing, sharp, brilliant, unshakable. And I whispered to myself, let's begin. Winter in New York was merciless that year. The wind clawed through every gap in the subway grates, and the radiators in my Brooklyn apartment hissed like angry ghosts. I was 22, 2 years out of Columbia, working as an energy engineer for a small green tech startup that promised to change the future. It sounded noble, and I believed it. I wanted to believe it. The office sat in an old warehouse near the East River. Cold air leaked through the brick walls, the kind of chill that made coffee a necessity, not a choice. My boss, a man named Donnelly, wore designer suits and used words like disruption and innovation, as though they were charms against failure. I discovered the first discrepancy on a Tuesday night, after everyone else had gone home. The numbers didn't make sense. Grants that vanished, projects marked complete that never existed. When I brought it up in the next meeting, the room fell silent. Donnelly gave me a thin smile. Clara, you're young, idealistic. That's a good thing in moderation. I'm saying the report's wrong. I said, if we claim those numbers, it's fraud. He leaned back, hands folded. It's called creative accounting. Don't worry about it. You'll get your bonus. I stared at him, realizing what he meant, silence, in exchange for security. When I didn't answer, he sighed. You have potential. Don't ruin it by trying to be a hero. I walked out that afternoon carrying a cardboard box with my mug, a photo from graduation, and the realization that honesty doesn't always come with applause. I thought the city would care that someone would see what I'd done and call it brave, but New York doesn't notice quiet integrity. It just keeps moving. By the end of that month, my savings were gone. My landlord left polite pink notices under my door. I spent my days scrolling job boards, my nights staring out at the snow falling over the East River. I remember one morning in particular. The pipes had frozen. The power flickered, and I sat wrapped in 2 sweaters drinking cold coffee. The mail slot clanged open, and another letter dropped onto the floor overdue. I didn't bother opening it. I thought of my father's words, how the world wasn't kind to dreamers, and for the first time I almost agreed. Then one afternoon, as I sat in a cafe near Columbia, I saw her, Professor Margaret Lane, my old environmental systems professor. She still carried herself like someone who knew exactly where she was going. Clara Whitmore, she said, her smile lighting up her face. I heard you were in the city. You look like someone who hasn't slept in weeks. Only because I haven't, I said. And she laughed. We sat near the window. The air smelled of espresso and rain. I told her everything. The startup, the firing, the debt, the uncertainty. She listened without interrupting, only stirring her coffee slowly. When I finished, she said, You remind me of myself at your age. Too honest for the wrong people. Too patient with the wrong dreams. I tried to smile, but my voice cracked. I just wanted to do something good. Then do it, she said. But stop asking for permission. I blinked at her. You make it sound easy. It's not. It never is. But if they don't believe in your worth, make the world need you. Those words hit me harder than any dismissal ever could. Make the world need you. Over the next few months, I started working on my own projects again. Small prototypes for solar conversion systems. Outreach programs for schools. I pitched ideas to anyone who'd listen. Most said no. Some laughed. A few donated small checks that barely covered equipment. But slowly, the idea took form, a foundation that connected renewable energy with education, helping communities build their own sustainable systems. In 2017, I launched Solara Foundation. 50 people showed up to the opening event in a rented hall near Union Square. I stood on the stage in a borrowed suit, palms sweating hard, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I told them about energy, yes, but also about second chances, about building something that couldn't be taken away. We don't just need light in our homes, I said. We need it in our choices. When I finished, there was a long, quiet moment before the applause. In that silence, I realized I'd done it. I'd created something that didn't need my father's approval to exist. Margaret was there smiling, like she already knew this would happen. Daniel Reed, my old friend from Columbia's law school, shook my hand after the speech. You just changed the game, he said. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood alone in the hall, surrounded by the smell of extinguished candles and cold air. The banner behind me read, Solara Powering Change. I thought about how the word Solara meant sunlight, how it could also mean hope. The next year, Solara grew faster than I could have imagined. Grants sponsors partnerships. People began calling it a movement. I made the Forbes Women 30 Under 30 list, which felt surreal. At the gala where they honored us, I stood near the back of the ballroom, holding a glass of champagne I didn't drink. Reporters snapped photos, lights flashed. Then across the room I saw him. Charles Whitmore, standing near the exit in his black suit, older but still unmistakable. For a heartbeat, our eyes met. His expression didn't change. He turned away before I stepped onto the stage. As I walked up to accept the award, applause thundered around me, but it sounded distant, muted, like ocean waves through glass. Some people appear just to confirm how far you've gone without them. When the ceremony ended, I slipped outside into the cold Manhattan air. The city lights reflected off the snow, bright enough to sting my eyes. I didn't cry. I just breathed, letting the air fill my lungs until the ache faded. Above me, the skyline pulsed with life, and for the first time since I'd left California, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was becoming. The first time I saw the coastline of southern France, the light felt almost unreal. Too pure, too wide. The Mediterranean shimmered like liquid glass, stretching endlessly beneath the pale blue sky. I stood barefoot on the sand, wind whipping strands of hair across my face, and tried to imagine what this empty stretch of land would become. Beside me, Maya Lopez adjusted her clipboard, squinting against the sun. She was 33, sharp-minded, and cautious with eyes that had seen too many doors close. 2 months earlier, she'd been fired from a luxury hotel in Nice for speaking out about wage theft. I had read her story in a small local paper and called her the same day. I still don't understand why you picked me, she said, her accent soft, uncertain. Because you tell the truth, I said. And because I trust people who've been overlooked. She smiled, then the kind that only comes from disbelief. We walked along the edge of the property. 30 acres of wild, sun-bleached cliffs overlooking the sea. The ground crunched under our boots. Seagulls circled above us, their cries swallowed by the wind. This will be a place where people remember what they're worth. I said, half to her, half to the wind. By the spring of 2019, the first trucks arrived. Concrete mixers, cranes, the smell of dust and diesel. The air buzzed with work. Men shouting in French, the clang of steel beams, the rhythmic thud of hammers blending with the sound of the waves. Every day I wore a hard hat and boots, walking through the half-built skeleton of what would become Azure Coast Retreat. Some nights I slept on site in a small, temporary office, falling asleep to the sound of the sea outside my window. Daniel called often from New York. You realize you're doing 3 full-time jobs, he said once. 2. I corrected. The sea does the rest. He laughed, but I could hear the worry in his voice. By Twinway, the resort was halfway finished, a minimalist dream of white walls and open terraces that caught the morning light. Investors toured the site, shaking hands, promising more funding. I believed them. Then came the call. It was late July, already humid. Maya knocked on my office door, face pale. They're pulling out, she said. What? The investors. They said the market's unstable. Global slowdown. They're cutting everything outside the U.S. I sank into the chair, staring at the blueprints spread across my desk. The sea outside looked cruelly calm. That night, Daniel and I talked for hours over video. His tie was loosened, his face drawn. Sell part of your Solara shares, he said. You'll keep control, but you'll have cash to finish construction. I worked too hard for Solara, I said. I know, he said gently. But this project, this resort, what does it mean to you? I looked out the window at the cliffs where the waves crashed endlessly below. It means freedom. He nodded. Then do it. I signed the papers the next day, selling 20% of my shares. The money was enough to restart construction, but it felt like cutting off a piece of myself. Still, as I watched the workers return, heard the sound of drills and laughter echoing again across the cliffs. I knew it was the right choice. Success only matters if you can lose everything and still keep going. By the summer of 2023, the resort was complete. Azure Coast Retreat rose from the cliffs like a sculpture, white stone walls curving toward the sea glass balconies, reflecting the sunlight, olive trees lining the walkways. It wasn't just a hotel, it was a sanctuary. Every detail carried purpose. Local workers paid fairly, ecosystems restored water, filtered naturally through solar systems designed by Solara's engineers. The opening was quiet, almost private. A few friends, Margaret, Lane, Daniel, and Maya. At sunset, we stood on the terrace as the light turned the sea to gold. "This place?" Maya whispered, "It feels alive." I smiled. That's because it was built by people who needed a second chance. When the last guest left, I stayed alone on the terrace. The air smelled of rosemary and salt. The horizon glowed orange before sinking into deep violet. My phone buzzed. Daniel again. His tone was different this time. Tense, clipped. "There's something you should know," he said. "I've been following a lead about your father. Whitmore Holdings. There's movement. Auditors are poking around their charitable division." I stared out at the water. "And it doesn't look good. If the government starts investigating, he won't walk away clean." A pause. The waves below rose and broke against the rocks, steady, relentless. "I see," I said finally. "Clara, I know what this means for you." I took a long breath. The wind off the sea whipped through my hair, cool and sharp. "Justice has a habit of showing up late," I said quietly. "But it never loses its way." He didn't answer right away. Just the faint sound of traffic behind him, a siren in the distance. "You're a better person than he ever was," he said finally. I ended the call and set the phone down. The sky was burning orange now, the sun dipping low enough to touch the sea. I leaned on the railing, eyes half closed, listening to the rhythm of the waves. For years I'd been chasing light, chasing proof that I could create something my father couldn't destroy. Standing there watching the last rays slip beneath the horizon, I realized I already had. The wind rose again, strong enough to lift my hair from my shoulders, and the sea glimmered like a mirror made of fire. I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. Tomorrow would bring new storms, new battles. But tonight, the light belonged entirely to me. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, my face was everywhere. Splashed across thumbnails, headlines, and timelines I hadn't even subscribed to. The video that started it all opened with slow piano music and a smirk. Amber Collins, a blonde 20-something influencer who called herself a truth journalist, stared into the camera and said, "They call her the Whitmore heiress. I call her the world's most glamorous hypocrite. She says it's charity. I say it's public relations." The words rolled out smooth, practiced. My name appeared in bold letters behind her. Clara Whitmore, philanthropy or facade. Clips of me from old interviews played in the background, me smiling on stage, shaking hands, standing beside solar panels and school children. Over it, her voice mocked, "How much good can one woman do when every photo comes with perfect lighting?" Within hours, the video hit 500,000 views. By morning, it had 5. When I walked into the Solara Foundation office that day, the air felt charged. Phones buzzed. The sound of typing was frantic. Sophie stood by the window, scrolling through her phone, face pale. "It's everywhere," she said quietly. "Twitter, TikTok, morning shows. People are quoting her word for word." Daniel was pacing near the conference table, phone pressed to his ear. "No, we don't sue," he said. "That's exactly what she wants. Just contain the press and get the official statement ready." I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. There it was, the endless stream of comments. "She's fake. Another rich girl pretending to save the world. Charity money for designer gowns." I scrolled until the words blurred. People hate successful women when they can't control them. My reflection in the screen looked tired, older than I remembered. I closed the laptop and said quietly, "Schedule the interview." Daniel turned, frowning. "Clara, that's not necessary. We can handle this through PR. I don't need them to defend me. I'll do it myself." He hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. I'll make the call." The talk show took place 3 days later in a Manhattan studio under lights so bright they felt surgical. The producers offered me makeup, a glass of water, and a warning. "Keep it light. This isn't a trial." Amber sat across from me, her dress metallic and sharp, like she'd dressed for battle. The host, A nervous man with a perfect smile introduced us and gave her the first question, so she said sweetly, "You claim Solara Foundation funds education and renewable projects, yet your social media shows yachts, galas, and million-dollar resorts. How much of your charity money funds your image?" The audience murmured. I felt the heat of the lights, the weight of the cameras. My heartbeat slowed. I looked directly into the lens. Solara's financial reports are public. Every dollar is accounted for. We don't need to explain transparency. We prove it through our work. Amber's smile didn't move. That's a convenient answer. But tell me, do you ever feel guilty? Living like this while pretending to be selfless? I never claimed to be selfless. I said, my voice steady. Just responsible. Her tone sharpened. Do you think you're a saint? I smiled. No, I just don't need to be the devil to exist. The studio went silent. The host blinked clearly, unsure what to say next. Someone in the control booth gestured wildly to cut to commercial. When the red light above the camera went off, Amber leaned forward, whispering, "That line won't save you." I stood, unclipped my mic, and met her gaze. It's not meant to. By the time I left the studio, the clip had already begun circulating. Within hours, the internet split in two, half calling me arrogant, the other half quoting my line as if it were gospel. I don't need to be the devil to exist. It trended for 3 days straight. Hashtag Clara Speaks, hashtag Women with Backbone. The irony was that none of it mattered. The people who hated me still hated me. The ones who admired me didn't know me. That night I drove home through the Manhattan Bridge traffic, the city glowing beneath the drizzle. The world outside looked like it was on fire. Screens, lights, billboards, all hungry for attention. In my apartment, I turned on the television. Every channel was replaying the same 30-second clip. I muted the sound and stood by the window. The skyline shimmered in the distance. The storm had arrived, but it wasn't loud. It was the quiet kind, the one that steals sleep instead of peace. I thought about what Amber had said about guilt and image. Maybe she was right about one thing. Every public life becomes a performance. The difference is what you're performing for. Across the ocean, my resort still stood, the lights of Azure Coast glowing faintly in my memory. I had built something real. That would have to be enough. I poured a glass of wine, sat on the couch, and scrolled through the news again. Headlines danced across the screen. Whitmore heiress. Claps back. Charity or charade. Public silence. Private power. I turned off the TV. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the city outside. The next morning, I woke to a dozen missed calls, most from reporters. I ignored them all. The only one I answered was Daniel. "You did fine," he said, voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Better than fine. You turned it around." I looked out the window at the gray Manhattan skyline. "No, I just told the truth," he sighed. "Truth isn't a headline, Clara. Maybe not," I said, "but it's the only thing that doesn't need one." When the call ended, I stood there for a long time, watching steam rise from the streets below. Somewhere across the country, my father was probably watching the same video, shaking his head. I could almost hear him. The world isn't kind to dreamers. Maybe it never would be, but it couldn't stop me either. That night I sat by the window again, the city stretching endlessly below me. The lights flickered alive and restless. Some storms don't need thunder or rain. They just wait, silent, patient, until the right pressure breaks the air wide open. The morning after the interview, I packed a small overnight bag and left San Diego before the city was fully awake. The freeway was empty, washed in gold by the early sun. A thin layer of fog drifted low over the Pacific, breaking apart as I drove north toward Santa Barbara. When the world gets too loud, the quiet ones are the only people who can make you hear yourself again. The trees along Highway 101 were shedding their leaves, amber and rust-colored, swirling across the road like sparks. I rolled the window down, letting the cool air fill the car. It smelled like salt eucalyptus and memory. The closer I got to my hometown, the more my chest tightened. 14 years had passed since I'd left, yet everything looked exactly the same. The stretch of coastline, the faded road signs, the familiar rhythm of the waves against the rocks. When I turned onto the narrow lane leading to my parents' house, my hands trembled slightly on the wheel. The house appeared from behind the hedge like a photograph that hadn't aged, a beige villa with white shutters and a garden that still bloomed with roses. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there wrapped in a gray cardigan, her hair streaked with silver now. Her expression held no surprise, only a quiet knowing. "Clara," she said softly. "Hi, Mom." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she stepped aside. "Come in. I just put the kettle on." The house smelled the same, jasmine tea and polished wood. Every picture frame along the hallway glimmered in the morning light. I noticed immediately the photos stopped in 2011. Family trips, Veronica's wedding grandchildren. But none of me. It was as if I'd been edited out of the family history. We sat in the living room across from each other, the low hum of the kettle filling the silence. My mother poured tea carefully, her hands steady. "Your father's been restless," she said. "He feels cornered." "Because of the investigation," she nodded, staring into her cup. "He's afraid. When he's afraid, he lashes out. You know how he is. I do nie. He says people are trying to destroy him. That you're part of it." I gave a small, humorless laugh. "I haven't spoken to him in years. That doesn't matter to him. What matters is control." I leaned back, glancing around the room. "Does he still keep his office upstairs?" "Yes," she said quietly. "He still works late, even now. Pretends he can fix everything from behind that desk." There was a pause. The kettle clicked off. My mother rose, walked to the sideboard, and returned with a small silver USB drive in her hand. She placed it on the coffee table between us. "You should see this." I looked up at her. "What is it? Files? Transfers? Records he never meant anyone to find." My pulse quickened. "Where did you get it?" Her eyes met mine, calm and defiant. "From his desk. He forgot that I still know his passwords." I stared at the tiny device. "Mom, this could end him," she finished. "Or save him, depending on how it's used." The room went still. Outside, the wind brushed against the window panes, carrying the faint scent of roses from the garden. "Why are you giving it to me?" I asked finally. She sighed. "Because I can't carry it anymore. You're the only one strong enough to know what to do." I nodded slowly. "Does he know?" She shook her head. "Not yet, but he will. So whatever you decide fast." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You shouldn't have to be afraid of him." Her fingers tightened around mine. "I stopped being afraid a long time ago, Clara. I just forgot what courage looked like." The rest of the day passed in a blur. We talked about nothing and everything. The weather, my sister, the garden. When I left that evening, the sky was streaked pink over the ocean. My mother stood in the doorway watching me go. "Be careful," she said. "He's still your father." "I know." I checked into a small coastal hotel just outside town. The room overlooked the sea waves crashing against the dark rocks below. The air smelled of rain and salt. I sat on the bed laptop, opened the USB drive in my hand. For a long time, I just stared at it. My mother's voice echoed in my head. "He forgot that I still know his passwords." Finally, I plugged it in. Folders filled the screen rows of files, marked with dates and codes. Charity Report, 2023 Offshore Transfer, Cayman Audit. My stomach tightened. I opened one. Bank transfers, millions of dollars moving between shell foundations, all under Whitmore Holdings. It wasn't creative accounting this time. It was theft. Another file contained emails between my father and senior partners. Their language careful coded. Redirecting funds through the Haven Initiative ensures discretion. Keep public focus on the foundation awards. The deeper I scrolled, the more the truth unfolded. His empire built not on legacy, but on manipulation. The glow of the laptop screen lit the room, turning everything else into shadow. My reflection in the glass looked detached, almost unrecognizable. My eyes burned, but no tears came. Justice sometimes begins with people who never thought they'd have the power to hold it. I reached for my phone and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "Clara." "It's late. I have something you need to see." "What kind of something?" Proof, I said. "Transfers, false foundations. It's all here." He was silent for a moment. "Jesus. Do you want me to forward this to the press?" "No." I closed the laptop slowly. "Keep it safe. Don't release it. Not yet." "Why not?" "Because this isn't about revenge," I said quietly. "I want justice to happen because it's right, not because I pushed it." Understood, he said. His voice softened. You okay? I looked out the window at the dark, endless sea. I don't know, but maybe that's the point. After I hung up, I sat for a long time, listening to the waves hammer the shore. The wind rattled the balcony door, and somewhere outside, a gull cried out over the surf. I turned off the screen and lay back on the bed. The silver USB sat on the nightstand, small and unassuming, like the beginning of something that could no longer be stopped. Outside, the tide was rising relentless and sure, just like the truth. November 20th, 2025. I woke to my phone vibrating nonstop on the nightstand. Notifications, missed calls, messages stacked on top of each other. For a few seconds, I couldn't tell if it was another attack on me or something bigger. Then I saw the headline, flashing across every screen. Federal prosecutors open investigation into Whitmore Holdings. The air in my bedroom went still. The article beneath it quoted the U.S. Attorney's Office evidence suggests large-scale misuse of charitable funds and offshore laundering connected to Whitmore Holdings. I set the phone down and sat on the edge of the bed, heartbeat steady, but cold. The truth was out. Across the country in Los Angeles, my father was probably already pacing in that glass tower he called an office. Later that day, Daniel called from D.C. It's happening, he said quietly. Torres's team went public. The files you gave me were enough to trigger a federal audit. Did you tell them where it came from? Anonymous, he said. Completely sealed. Your name's nowhere near it. I stared out the window of my San Diego apartment, the Pacific gray and calm. Good. Let it stay that way. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, chaos unfolded like a storm. I could imagine it vividly. The emergency board meeting the mahogany table, gleaming under fluorescent lights, executives whispering behind closed doors. I'd seen that world once. It fed on denial. My father stood at the head of the table, the Wall Street Journal headline thrown across the polished surface. Lies, he barked. Fabrications. This family is clean. Our company is clean. Veronica sat 2 seats down, still in her Navy business suit, eyes tired from nights of covering for him. Dad, federal prosecutors don't start investigations without cause. Charles slammed his fist against the table, the sound cracking through the room. We are Whitmores. We don't lose. We control the story. He ordered the PR director to prepare a press campaign. Charity videos, images of him at volunteer sites smiling with children in hard hats. Manufactured sincerity. People aren't afraid of being wrong. They're afraid of being seen. While the board scrambled, Veronica caught a glimpse of something on his desk. A printed authorization, her father's signature scrawled across it. $3 million wired to a Cayman-based foundation. The recipient name, Aurora Pipeline Project. Her breath caught. Aurora, the same false name that had appeared in the USB files. That night, she went back to her office, locked the door, and opened her laptop. The glow of the screen lit her pale face as she searched the internal database. The emails were there, dozens of them. Reallocation processed, charity covers transfer, keep external comms clean. Then, one line in particular froze her redirect funds from Solara-affiliated grant. My foundation's name, my work, used to hide his theft. God, she whispered, voice trembling. He really did it. For the first time, she understood why I left. In Washington, Daniel walked into the marble halls of the Department of Justice. The sound of his shoes echoed as he approached the office of Samuel Torres, the federal prosecutor leading the inquiry. He placed the silver USB on the desk. The source wants to remain unnamed, but everything you need is on here. Bank transfers, emails, offshore ledgers. Torres studied him for a moment, then nodded. You realize this will bring him down completely, Daniel replied. Maybe it's time someone did. The next morning, the markets opened to the sound of panic. Stocks for Whitmore Holdings froze within an hour. Television anchors repeated the same phrase over and over. Assets seized, accounts frozen, internal audit ongoing. At the Solara Foundation, I sat at my desk watching the live coverage on the muted screen. The ticker across the bottom read, Whitmore Empire collapses under investigation. Sophie stepped into my office holding her phone. Clara, it's everywhere. They're saying your father might face criminal charges. I turned the volume up for a second, listening to the distant voice of a reporter outside the Los Angeles headquarters. Federal agents have entered the building behind me. I turned it back down. Sophie's voice was tentative. Are you okay? I exhaled, eyes still on the screen. Better than ever. She blinked. You don't sound angry. This isn't anger, I said softly. It's order. Things are finally where they belong. For years the world had seen him as a visionary, a builder, a man who made empires. But empires built on lies always fall the same way, loudly, and then all at once. That afternoon I walked down to the edge of the water. The Pacific was a mirror of steel clouds rolling in from the horizon. I could feel the wind shift a change in pressure like the ocean itself was exhaling. I thought of my mother, her quiet courage, as she handed me that USB. I thought of Veronica, somewhere in her office, staring at the evidence she could no longer ignore. And I thought of him, my father, standing in that tower, watching the empire he'd worshipped begin to crumble. Justice doesn't always knock on your door. Sometimes it walks in through the same door you thought you locked behind you. By nightfall, every major network carried the same footage, agents escorting executives out of Whitmore Holdings, cardboard boxes of files stacked in the lobby, reporters shouting questions no one answered. Daniel called again. It's done, he said. They're freezing everything. Torres will issue warrants by next week. Good, I said. He hesitated. You know this doesn't erase what he did to you. I don't need it to, I said. I just needed the truth to stand. When the call ended, I sat in the dark for a long time. Outside, the city lights shimmered on the water. Somewhere far north in Los Angeles, another light was going out. It wasn't triumph I felt, not even peace. Just a quiet understanding that what's broken eventually finds a way to break open. The truth had finally surfaced, and unlike everything my father built, it didn't need permission to exist. The day before Thanksgiving, the air at Azure Coast carried that rare kind of calm that only comes before something immense. The resort shimmered in late afternoon light, hundreds of golden lanterns strung between olive trees. Long tables draped in white linens, crystal glasses reflecting the sea. From the terrace, I watched the staff move like choreography. Maya Lopez, headset in place, paced across the courtyard, her clipboard tucked under one arm. Stage lights. Check them again, she called through the radio. And someone make sure the vineyard shipment arrived. The rosé needs to breathe for at least an hour. The sound of laughter drifted up from the main hall, mingling with the soft hum of the waves below. Every corner of the place glowed, every detail measured and deliberate. It wasn't just a dinner anymore. It was a statement. I stood on the second-floor balcony, the wind lifting my hair, and took it in. The world I had built from the very things they once used to dismiss me. Behind me, I heard footsteps. You've outdone yourself, Margaret said, handing me a glass of white wine. The reflection of the sunset danced across her glasses. I smiled. I didn't do it for that, no. She said, her voice gentle. You did it to end a chapter. I looked down at the courtyard again. I just want a dinner where everyone's welcome. No power games, no hierarchy, just people. She sipped her wine. Then you've already won. A black car pulled up near the entrance below. The tires crunched against the gravel, slow, deliberate. My chest tightened before I even saw who it was. The door opened, and Veronica stepped out. Her hair was perfectly styled as always, but her face looked older, pacer drained. She clutched a leather folder against her chest like it was the only thing holding her together. Margaret followed my gaze. Family. Something like that, I said quietly. I met Veronica at the base of the stairs. Neither of us spoke as I led her inside through the lobby and into one of the private sitting rooms overlooking the sea. The room was quiet except for the sound of waves hitting the rocks below. She didn't sit right away. She just stood there staring out at the water. It's beautiful, she said softly. Thank you, I said. I thought you'd hate it. I don't hate you, Clara. She turned, and for the first time I believed her. I just didn't understand you. I poured her a glass of water and sat across from her. The silence stretched until she finally spoke again. Dad's being indicted, she said. Federal charges, fraud, embezzlement, wire transfers, everything. Her voice trembled. The press won't leave our house. Mom's refusing interviews, and Dad. She stopped shaking her head. He's still trying to blame you. I took a slow breath. He would. She looked at me, pleading. Tell me what to do. You don't have to do anything I said. The truth is already working. Her hand shook slightly as she opened the folder and placed it on the table between us. This is everything. Every transfer, every shell company. Proof that he did it. I don't need that. Yes, you do. You could end this faster. I shook my head. If we turn truth into a weapon, we become him. Let it go through the system. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't understand. I've been helping him for years, signing papers, covering audits. I thought I was protecting the family, but I was protecting a lie. I stood walking to the window, my reflection caught in the glass beside hers. Then stop now. She turned away, voice breaking. You make it sound so easy. You left. I stayed. I became him. I walked back to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. No one has to live inside someone else's mistakes forever. Her body trembled under my hand. Then she covered her face, sobbing quietly, shoulders shaking. I didn't move. I just stayed there, listening to the sea crash against the cliffs. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and rain. When she finally lifted her head, her makeup was streaked, but her eyes were clearer. He's going to prison, isn't he? Yes, I said. But that's between him and the truth now. She nodded slowly, clutching the folder. What happens to us after this? We start over. Separately, maybe. But honestly, she let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. You sound like Mom. She was always stronger than he knew. For a while, we just sat there in silence, watching the first flash of lightning far out over the horizon. The sky had turned deep violet, the wind louder now, the sea restless beneath it. Looks like a storm, Veronica murmured. Yes, I said, stepping to the glass, watching the faint shimmer of rain fall across the distance. But not the kind that destroys things, the kind that cleans them. She followed my gaze, her reflection beside mine, two silhouettes bound by blood and difference. When she left, the air in the room felt lighter somehow. The storm outside had begun to roll in, thunder echoing faintly from somewhere beyond the coast. I stood by the window long after her car disappeared down the road. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the moment you stop letting the war live inside you. I turned off the lights and stepped out onto the terrace. The lanterns swayed gently in the wind, their golden light flickering against the dark sky. Far out on the horizon, lightning lit up the clouds for a brief, stunning moment. Tomorrow there would be a dinner. People would smile, cameras would flash, music would play. But for tonight, the world was quiet again. And for the first time in years, so was I. Thanksgiving night arrived with the kind of perfection no planner could buy. The Mediterranean air was cool, steady, full of salt and music. Golden lights spilled from every archway of the Azure Coast Resort, the lanterns shimmering like captured stars. From the terrace, I could see the entire property alive. Guests laughing, glasses clinking, the low hum of jazz curling through the night. Inside, the grand ballroom gleamed. White tables stretched in even rows, candles flickering in crystal holders. Olive branches and wildflowers lined the centerpieces. The sound of waves echoed faintly through the open doors that led to the sea. Maya Lopez moved through the crowd like she was conducting an orchestra, her headset glinting beneath her hair. Sound check now, she said into her mic. Lights at 50% for the opening. She caught my eye from across the room, smiled quickly, then disappeared toward the stage. Daniel stood by the registration desk, ticking off VIP names as security ushered in another wave of guests. Actors, entrepreneurs, scientists, and investors. The energy in the room felt electric, hopeful. I watched him laugh with one of the donors, his usual tension replaced by quiet pride. And then I walked in. The room shifted slightly, subtle but unmistakable. Heads turned. The soft murmur of voices dipped to a hush before rising again. My gown was simple ivory silk that caught the light like water. For once, the attention didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Julian Grant, one of Solara's earliest supporters, found me near the entrance. "You've created something remarkable here," he said, clinking his glass lightly against mine. "I've never seen a philanthropic event with this kind of energy. It's live." "Because it's not about money," I said. "It's about reminding people what money is supposed to do." He grinned. Still the philosopher-engineer, I see. Before I could respond, a familiar face approached. Rachel Foster from Worldline News, her press badge catching the light. "Clara," she said warmly, her camera crew hovering behind her. "This is your night." "Congratulations," I smiled, but gently corrected her. "No, Rachel. Tonight's for everyone who was never invited to the table." She blinked, then nodded, something thoughtful passing through her expression. "Beautifully said." As she moved away, I caught sight of Margaret Lane near the front, her white hair glowing in the candlelight. She raised her glass to me, a quiet acknowledgement that said everything words couldn't. When the music softened and the lights dimmed slightly, Margaret took the stage. Her voice carried easily through the hall, warm and confident. Years ago, she began, I met a young woman who refused to choose between idealism and impact. She believed that doing good shouldn't require permission. Tonight, we celebrate that belief and the work of Solara Foundation. Applause swelled, rolling through the room like a wave. Please welcome our founder, Clara Whitmore. The spotlight found me. My pulse steadied as I walked toward the stage, the soft fabric of my gown brushing against the marble floor. When I reached the podium, I looked out at the crowd. Faces from a dozen countries, men and women who'd built, created, fought, and believed. Thank you, I said, letting the quiet linger before I continued. When we built Solara, we weren't just building technology or infrastructure. We were building dignity. We were building the idea that light belongs to everyone. I glanced toward the ocean. Tonight isn't just a dinner. It's a reminder that everyone deserves a place in the story of something good. For a moment, the only sound was the sea. Then the applause came, loud, full, rising from every corner of the room. I felt it vibrate through the stage, through my chest. When it faded, a voice called out from the media section. Clara Rachel said, microphone in hand, "Do you have anything you'd like to say to your family?" I looked directly at her, smiling softly. Only, thank you. They taught me what it means to build my own table. The crowd reacted with quiet surprise, then admiration. Cameras flashed, catching the curve of my smile and the reflection of gold light in my hair. Behind the press line, Maya stood watching, her hands clasped. Daniel nodded once, a silent, "You did it." The music swelled again, soft jazz mixed with the sound of laughter. Guests began to mingle, drifting toward the open doors that led to the terrace. I stepped down from the stage, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, posing for photos. Out on the terrace, the sea shimmered beneath the lanterns, calm and endless. Couples danced, their shadows moving like ripples on the floor. I let myself breathe for the first time all evening. Then I noticed a murmur spreading through the crowd. It started small, a whispered comment. A phone pulled out, another guest leaning in to listen. The noise shifted, the kind of ripple that precedes a wave. Maya approached, her expression cautious. "You might want to hear this before it hits the mic feeds," she said, holding out her phone. A message flashed across the screen. Breaking news. Whitmore Holdings CEO Charles Whitmore, indicted on federal charges, 10-year sentence, possible. Around us, the whispers grew. Someone said softly, "It's official." Another voice, "He's finished." For a heartbeat, the room seemed to stop breathing. Glasses hovered midair. Even the music faltered for a fraction of a second before resuming quieter this time. I handed the phone back to her. "Keep everyone calm. This is their night, not his." She nodded, eyes bright with something between pride and disbelief. "You really planned everything, didn't you?" "Not this," I said, "but it fits." I stepped outside again, the cool wind brushing against my face. The sea stretched out before me, black and gleaming under the moonlight. The sound of the waves was steady, ancient, unbothered by human noise. Justice comes like the tide. Slow, patient, unstoppable. Behind me, laughter began again, tentative at first, then fuller. The music picked up. The guests carried on. Life. I realized doesn't pause for anyone's reckoning. I turned back toward the terrace doors. Across the room, Maya and the staff watched from a distance. Their faces glowed with quiet pride. I gave them a small nod. The night moved forward. The golden lights flickering like constellations, the air thick with warmth music and the faint scent of olive blossoms. The storm had finally passed. What remained was truth, and the light it left behind. Morning broke over the Mediterranean like a whisper. The first light poured through the glass walls of my suite, stretching long and golden across the white stone floors. Outside, the sea was impossibly calm. Soft ripples gliding toward the shore, waves folding into themselves with the rhythm of deep, steady breathing. I woke slowly still, half inside the dream of last night's laughter and music. For a moment, I forgot everything. The cameras, the whispers, the news breaking mid-gala. All I heard was the sound of the ocean and the faint hum of gulls drifting by the balcony. Then my phone buzzed on the nightstand, once, twice, then again and again, until I finally reached for it. 54 missed calls, all from Dad. My chest tightened, not in fear, not in anger, just something heavier than both. I scrolled to the last message, a single line sent just after midnight. "I'm sorry." 2 words, no punctuation. I stared at them for a long time, the letters burning into the screen until they blurred. The sunlight crept across the bed, warm on my skin. But it didn't reach the hollow ache in my chest. I thought I would feel vindicated when this day came. I thought justice would taste like satisfaction, but it didn't. It tasted like quiet. I set the phone down and turned toward the window. The sky outside was a watercolor of peach and gold, and for the first time in years there was no noise, no pressure, no proving. Just stillness. Someone knocked on the door. "Come in," I said, my voice hoarse. Margaret stepped inside holding a tray with 2 cups of coffee. Her white hair was pulled back, her linen blouse wrinkled from travel, but her eyes were sharp and kind. She set the tray down on the small table by the balcony and studied me for a moment. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I guess I didn't need to." She poured the coffee, the steam rising between us. "He called, didn't he?" I nodded. 54 times. She didn't ask if I planned to call him back. She already knew. Instead, she handed me a cup. "You don't have to answer, Clara. Forgiveness isn't the same as permission." I took a sip, the bitterness grounding. "I'm not sure what forgiveness even feels like anymore." She sat down opposite me, folding her hands over her knee. "Forgiveness isn't acceptance," she said. "It's just leaving the battlefield. And you've been fighting a long time." A faint smile tugged at my mouth. Maybe too long. We sat in silence for a while, the waves outside filling the spaces between our words. The sun had risen higher now, casting bright reflections across the water. When the phone rang again, I almost didn't pick it up. But the caller ID said Daniel Reed. "Morning," I said softly. "You're up early," he replied. His tone was steady but careful, the way you speak when you know something matters. "I have news. Go ahead." "Charles just filed paperwork with the board. He's transferring 10% of his shares in Solara Foundation to you. Effective immediately." I blinked, unsure I heard right. He's stepping down completely. No more involvement, no more seats on any committees. He's walking away. I pressed my fingers to my forehead. Why Daniel hesitated. "He sent something to your office in San Diego. A sealed envelope. I haven't opened it." There was a knock at the door again, this time from the hotel staff. I opened it, and a young woman stood there holding a plain white envelope. "For Ms. Whitmore," she said in a French accent. My hands went cold. "Thank you," I murmured. Daniel's voice was still on the line. "He must have sent copies. Go ahead, open it." I hung up without answering, set the phone aside, and broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten note. "For my daughter, the one who taught me the lesson I should have learned a lifetime ago. Kindness can be stronger than power." No signature. Just that line in his unmistakable handwriting. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. Not for him, not for what he took or what he lost. I felt lighter somehow, as if a door I didn't even realize I was holding shut had finally opened. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Margaret watched me, her eyes soft. "What does it say?" "That he finally understood something I said." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's enough." I stood and walked to the balcony, pushing the glass doors open. The wind swept through the room, carrying the scent of salt and citrus. From up here, the entire coast stretched endlessly, the sunlight turning the sea into liquid gold. I stepped outside barefoot, the tiles cool beneath my feet. The horizon glowed brighter now, almost blinding. I could hear faint laughter from the staff below, Maya's voice among them, cheerful and commanding. The sound grounded me in the present. For years I thought justice would arrive like thunder, loud, undeniable, impossible to ignore. But now that it was here, it felt like this, a calm morning quiet, waves light spreading over a clean horizon. Justice had come, and I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not even to him. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the salt air, feeling the sunlight trace across my face. The sea was still clear as glass, as if the storm had never existed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting. I was simply standing still. 3 months later, the sun was high over San Diego, painting the city in soft gold. The Solara Foundation Hall was alive with movement. Voices echoing through the glass atrium, the scent of fresh flowers and coffee drifting through the air. Golden banners hung from the ceiling embroidered with words that shimmered under the light. Evelyn Whitmore Women in Science Scholarship, empowering the next generation. I stood at the back of the room for a moment, taking it all in. The crowd was larger than I expected, students, mentors, journalists, and supporters who had followed Solara's journey since its uncertain beginning. On stage, the new scholarship logo glowed against a deep blue backdrop, a rising sun breaking through clouds. It felt right. It felt earned. Margaret was seated in the front row beside my mother. Evelyn looked radiant in a soft cream suit, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Veronica sat beside her, a quiet smile on her face. They had both flown in early, helping with the final details and rehearsing speeches. As I approached the podium, the hum of the crowd softened to stillness. My voice felt steady, my heartbeat calm. Today I began is not about me. It's about the women who decide that their stories don't have to end where someone else told them to stop. It's about courage that doesn't ask for permission. I paused, letting the words find their weight in the room. When we started Solara, we dreamed of bringing light to the world. But light doesn't just come from technology. It comes from people. From the women who keep building learning and believing even when the world tells them they've had enough. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the projector and the sound of someone in the back wiping away tears. I looked down at my mother, her eyes shining. "This scholarship bears your name, Mom," I said softly, "because you taught me that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stays. It endures. It listens." She pressed her hands together, smiling through tears. From the front row, Maya stood up when I invited her to speak. She wore her Navy resort uniform, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture proud but humble. When I met Clara, she said, her voice steady, "No one else wanted to give me a second chance. I was a woman who had already been written off." But she looked at me and said, "If the world shuts the door, we build another one." The crowd chuckled softly. Maya glanced at me, her eyes warm. She did, and she let me help build it. So tonight, as I watch new women step into that same light, I just want to say, thank you for believing that people like me still belong. Applause filled the room, long and full, echoing against the glass. I felt something loosen inside me, an old knot of pain that had lived there too long. When the applause faded, I took the stage again. When you give someone an opportunity, I said, you're not just changing their life. You're healing the part of yourself that once needed someone to believe in you. The crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Margaret reached for my mother's hand. Veronica wiped her eyes. For a second, it felt like the years between us, the distance, the hurt, the silence, had finally softened into something human again. After the ceremony ended, I stepped outside through the side doors into the late afternoon light. The air smelled of salt and sun-warmed stone. Down the hill, I could hear the faint music of the after-party, soft jazz drifting up from the patio. I slipped off my shoes and walked toward the beach. The sand was cool beneath my feet, the tide low and gentle. Each wave curled around my ankles before pulling back, leaving behind small crescents of foam. The horizon burned with the amber glow of sunset. The same ocean that had carried me away years ago now felt like it was carrying me back, not to the same place, but to the person I'd become. I looked out across the water, wind lifting my hair, the light fading into gold. They once said I didn't belong at their table. Now I've built one that opens to the world. Some tables aren't meant to be returned to. They're meant to inspire new ones. I turned back toward the foundation where laughter carried through the air, Margaret's deep and warm, Maya's bright and proud, my mother's soft and sure. For the first time, everything felt complete. And if anyone listening tonight has ever been told they don't belong, remember this build anyway. Build your own talai, even if you start with nothing but your two hands. This story, my story, is for you.